Harry, thank you for the introduction. For me, it's rather overwhelming, in fact, to be here. Never thought that we would actually come here to sort of show the work that we do in India. But anyway, quickly, I'd just like to thank all of you who are here to come here and listen. Archizoom, Cyril and all his associates who've been very instrumental in putting the exhibition together. Just very quickly, a quick background. Well, like Harry mentioned, I studied in the US, worked in Europe and in the West for a good 10 years, and then decided to go back to India. More fundamentally for me was something that was more intuitive, where this idea of going back home was a place where I could respond more from an emotion, more from an intuition, rather than think about things intellectually. Yes, the background of the academia, the studies, but for me that was something very fundamental that was missing, and hence sort of the journey back home. So today what I'm going to show you really is more an unfolding, so sort of an organic unfolding process, which doesn't really have a specific direction, and has been a journey that can modify, change, adapt. So it's something that was not a manifesto, but it's a condition that is continuously evolving as time changes. And so this is more a journey that I'm going to show you through the slides that I present this evening. Can we? Can we get the lights down? Take the lights down. Yeah. So very quickly, this is a very important slide, taken a few years ago, in fact, and this condition still exists in 2011. For me, what's fascinating is this relationship of man, machine, and nature, and this constant struggle to maintain a balance, so sort of to try and keep an equilibrium. And for me, that's sort of a sort of fascinating place of this sort of tripartite arrangement, or this condition that exists, I think, everywhere. Again, what I'm showing you just are different atmospheres of the country. India's 1,200 million people, and one would think that there should be complete anarchy. I mean, what's wonderful about it for me is the chaos, and my interest is sort of finding a space in this chaos, because that's I think a condition that will always remain constant. So rather than try and order things, it's more to try and find a position inside this constantly moving condition, which I would call India, or even the globe at large. There's a very interesting story that Peter Wilson, who's a well-known architect here in Europe, he was visiting us in Alibag, and he said the Aborigines in Australia, when they sleep at night, they take a stick and run it into the ground, in a way, while they're asleep, that the world sort of stops, so that when in their waking state, they can, at that point, the world can then start again to move, and the idea of flux can occur, and then they can be responsive. So I thought it was sort of quite an interesting idea of marking space, in a much larger framework of an understanding of the universe, in a very sort of, I would say, highly sophisticated culture. Anyway, coming back, these are just, again, housing. Most of the built landscape in India is outside the framework of formal architecture. It's non-professional, and you can see the ability or the intuitive sort of response to how people manage, how they arrange themselves. So again, these are just conditions that we observe, that we look at. This is in the north. This is a settlement, a large sort of slum that has evolved. But they have a system of organizing, of planning. Again, relationship to trees. The earlier slide was a relationship to water. Most of the water in India, you actually go to the water. Either it's a stream, a tank, a well. It's not piped. The water doesn't really come to your house through some sort of unknown place. So these conditions that relationships are developed. So again, just showing sort of in a religious space, the idea of shade, this sort of symbiotic relationship of very fundamental aspects of the surrounding. Again, this idea of understanding, climatic conditions. We have a sort of very heavy monsoon on the west coast, and I had absolutely no idea. I've grown up in an urban city in Mumbai, and so on returning, I decided to move to a smaller place, a place where I could once again engage back into these sort of very fundamental conditions that architecture has to respond to. And it's been a long process, understanding the rain, the intensity of it, and how the anxieties during the monsoons, how they change, how space constricts. So these are just sort of images of which can be beautiful, but at the same time also quite threatening. So this idea of working between these two conditions of beauty and a sort of an awesomeness or a sort of a violence that both exist even in a condition like the monsoons in India. Just sort of interesting things that one encounters. I call this, these images are sort of very special to me. This is something set in, I think it was the 6th century in India, where they used to split stone. And they sort of made these sort of square cuts, and then would drive wooden pegs, and then pour water, and then the wood would expand and basically split the stone. And people still, even now, build in this way in certain places. But just sort of different conditions that are occurring in the country right now. Again, sort of a very interesting condition where a highway, India's in a huge sort of rapid development. And sort of in this act of violence of, cutting through a building, something new is revealed. It's sort of very interesting, the whole idea of the section and inhabitation that once occurred inside is now exposed, right onto the street. So this sort of very fine line between this idea of balance between what is hidden and what is revealed, also in the idea of an act of, in a sort of a violent act. This is taken about, I think, 8 months ago, and just shows the sort of relationship of what's happening in India. And for me, what's interesting is actually these guys out here, how at ease they are even with what's changing around them. And there's a certain comfort. And again, what is of interest or curiosity to me is this idea of overlap. Rather than dismiss one for the other, or say, tradition is better than, development or modernity, maybe is there a place where they both can meet, rather than be in conflict. So this is a slide that sort of, for me, is quite important in the potential of what can possibly exist in between this space and that space. Again, conditions of, rather than wipe away or erase, this is an introduction of a motorcycle or a cycle that's, now the owners have been able to purchase that, and how they make that inclusive, how they bring that in. This ramp has been sort of integrated into the staircase of the front door. And what's wonderful, because the motorcycle now is a sort of very important possession, it's actually taken into the living room of the house in the evenings. But it's interesting, just the sheer potential of how space can change with conditions. And again, here, this is a sort of a tribe that used to live in the forest. They've been now displaced. They've been moved out of the forest, and they primarily in the monsoons use the rivers to fish. This is made out of bamboo. It's woven, and that's sort of a very interesting, architectural structure in many ways. But what was interesting is their ability to adapt, because they used to initially have access to skins. Animals in the forest, they would use the skin to make a waterproof lining, and these are used as boats. Since they've been displaced, what was interesting is these are sort of cement bags, that the construction along the road, concrete roads, that the cement bags are thrown, and they collect it. It's free. And then the asphalt that is used to tarmac the road. So they used that as waterproofing. And that's what I was talking about when Harry mentioned limited resources, the ingenuity of sort of a condition which can seem very extreme or difficult, and then to find a space in some way to make something out of it, to take opportunity of that. So these are just slides sort of giving you an introduction in what possibilities lie in this sort of confluence, or rather, even in the conflict. Another, this is a traditional Indian shirt. They need a pocket there because this is basically a cloth, a single cloth that's wrapped. It's called a dhoti. And it is interesting. This is in Rajasthan. You see these forks, which are a fabulous abstraction of the extension of your hand, or sort of a very precise understanding of the hand and how it works, and how it's been sort of abstracted into a tool, a farming tool. We have it here in the exhibition. But what was interesting for me was, that's the traditional dress, and this old man, who sold 3 of these forks to me. So while he was sitting, I asked him, how come you're wearing this T-shirt? And he says, well, I get it for free because the guys who are advertising plywood or glue or whatever, something for advertising is big, and so they give us these T-shirts for free. And while we were exchanging money, he puts his hand into this pocket. I call him the pocket man. And what was interesting is that he said, yeah, I got this done at home. He just took the T-shirt home, cut it, and then his wife basically introduced this lovely pink satin sort of piping. And it's a detail. Again, a detail where you allow for things to occur, but there is a way to sort of, in a sense, intervene in an interesting way. So it's not one of resistance, but one of acceptance. And I thought it was a sort of very interesting condition. It makes sense. The T-shirt is, works in the weather, washable, plus it's free. So, why not? And he can't put the money in he has no pockets because he still continues to wear his, single cloth called the dhoti. Now again, so this is something that we continuously do, this constant documentation of these conditions that are happening all the time, and it's everywhere. And in some way to somehow use this opportunity to maybe, make in the process of making architecture. This used to be our old studio. It's now called the reading room. It's an extension that we made to our house. But what's interesting is this net. It's basically agriculture net. And we could only use this because of this very large tree which acts like an umbrella. And you'll see it in the next slide. Take the tree away and the building, fails in a sense, or the material fails. So this close sort of positioning of material, position, climatic conditions, and how one can actually take advantage. So it's a sort of very passive approach. All of this happened in the process of making, out of a need, out of economy of means, time, and sort of looking for this gap. So it's sort of trying to maintain an eye that continuously observes and tries to seek potential even in something, that one might dismiss as, not being important. And I don't know, it's just the idea of being open to receive. But anyway, this was our studio for a while, and now it's the extension to our house. Studio Mumbai basically is a sort of collection of now 115 artisans, from carpenters to masons, plumbers, electricians, and they work full time. Most of the people, for example, this gentleman here, he comes from a lineage of 60 generations, so he says, but I'd maybe water it down to 20, and that's good for me. And it's amazing, this sort of tacit knowledge that they actually carry with them. Going back to the comment that I made was that most of India is built outside the framework of formal architecture. And these are really the people who have shaped India in the past and are continuing to shape India, even in this sort of very extreme condition. So this is something that they've learned, watching me. I draw with a red pen, and so now everyone has exactly the same red pen. And it's this amazing ability of watching, observing, and being able to pick up and draw. So these are really our working drawings. This is the process in which we work. It's through gestures, through the nod of a head. Many times, yes and no are the same. So yes and no, they're exactly the same. And you sort of try and figure out, what's actually being said. So it could be a gentle nod, which is yes, and then a slight maybe. So this condition changes. And I'm bringing this up because it's all about a relationship, all about an and understanding, and it's in the subtlety of what is said and what is not said. So many times when we're discussing ideas, concepts, you'd ask them the same question 3 days later, and he says, "Why didn't you ask me this earlier?" But it's the manner in which you've asked the question that changes the atmosphere of the question to get a very specific response. So it's, for me, I'm beginning to do, or what we are all trying to sort of do. It's like a dance. You kind of continuously adjust yourself. You're always adjusting yourself to the partner, to be responsive to the partner, not that you're doing your own thing and they're doing their own thing. And I think that's very important. I mean, at least in the way we work, it's about an understanding of a position that each one takes. So here you can see the process. They've learned how to draw. That's something as a skill that they just intuitively have. And then this is basically the models, the mock-ups, a full-scale mock-up here, which takes them about a day and a half. And what we've discovered is it's a great tool because it allows many more people to engage, from the client to me, to everyone who's in the compound, to actually participate. Everyone goes and stands underneath, checks the height, and it's interesting. We ran an experiment where we tried to draw this section, but they actually built it faster, so by hand. So we've decided that this is the best way to actually go about, discovering the making of the building. So this is just a slide that sort of documents, just some of the processes. Tools that we use, from the electronic age. Where we work, we don't have, even till date, we don't have power supply for 6 hours every day. So we have to balance ourselves between electricity and no electricity. So the ability to, from time to time, work with machines, but also be dependent on the skill of the hand. So just a sort of collection of materials, tools that we make in the process of trying to sort of build architecture. So this is just an atmosphere of the methods of what we use to make things. For me, this is a very interesting slide. And I call it postures in architecture, postures in the making of architecture. And it's an extension. You can see all four, 2 hands, 2 feet, all connected together. And for me, that's interesting. The sort of continuity of thinking, or the thought process that runs through your body to connect to the material and act, very precisely. That it needs to be very precise at that moment. And you see this all the time. I think you saw in the introduction, the slides when we were setting things up. They're more comfortable sitting down and actually working on fours. And in a sense, this is also like, how do I say, it's an extension of yoga, because to maintain these postures, I can't do that. And it was an interesting situation that we observed. In Venice, when we were setting up the exhibition there, we needed to do this black cemented screed floor. And so we had the general contractor in Italy, in Venice, and they said, no, we can't do this. And the carpenters had never done this before. But they'd seen the masons do it. And Sam, who was introduced, who's an American who has lost his way to India, and he's been there now 5 years. And it was interesting. So while we were working, he couldn't sit because the posture required you to be seated flat on the floor, not for 10 minutes, but for a couple of hours to work that. So maybe in tradition, what we call that, tradition is being lost. Could it be possibly be lost in just the postures that we take? While, because the materials might still exist, but if we don't sit or stand in a particular way, or postures that we take, maybe that process would be lost. And it was interesting because these guys could actually sit for a few hours and they worked on the floor. I couldn't even do it for 5 minutes. We both come from the same place. We're both Indians. But culturally, the dislocation that has occurred maybe in the way I've grown up. So it's interesting for me to observe that possibly materials or processes could get lost purely in just the postures of making. Quickly, I'm going to run through the slides because I've got 4 projects. They're houses that we had started with because that's what we could do as a small outfit. We started with 10 people. But again, for us, what's important is observing the ground. the act of cutting the ground is extremely important. We have something called the Bhoomi Puja, which is, it's a sort of an offering, in a sense, to the ground, because something that has evolved over thousands or millennia. And the sort of humility that you have to enter, which I've observed, this whole idea of cutting the ground. So the idea of making foundation is extremely precious. And so when you make the cut, something can also be revealed. Anyway, in the process, we uncovered this sort of sweet water well, which was 20 meters away from the sea. And the sweet water was balanced by the density of the salt water. And so we used this condition in a way to sort of center the entire project. It's a house for 3 families. There's sort of grandfather, father, and their sons and kids. So it's sort of an extended family. And here I'm just showing a slide. These are our consultants. Again, the tacit knowledge I was talking about. Because this gentleman here is a well builder. He was a master well builder. You can see his crutches. At the age of about 20, he actually fell into the well that they were constructing. But rather than fear, he spent the rest of his life mastering something, this action that nearly took his life. And it's a very interesting condition of how to overcome that, rather than create a fence or build a wall and be fearful. So he developed this sort of very innate understanding of what actually lies underneath the ground. No measuring tools, but just all about the sense. And that's his crew out here. He's there, sitting there, supervising. And it was all, it all came down to a few inches, 25 feet, which would be, maybe 10 meters below the ground, where there was the source of sweet water. And it was important that we don't compress the soil, because over time, if that closed, you basically would lose that water source. So we had to straddle that with a small beam, and it was very precise. Something that remained latent in the ground. And how do you see it? And it's interesting because you can see things just based on a sense and having faith in a sense, but you have to develop a practice for that sense. And that's the whole idea of making things, of continuously doing it again and again and again till it becomes an intrinsic part of thought and body. And that's what it is. It's basically a sweet water well which is central to the house. And I call it the foundation, in a sense the belly button. Because the entire house is, very quickly I'll run through. These are sort of air holes, water and rain comes through it. And you can see the different conditions. The earlier one was in the monsoon. You can see the high water. And this is in the summertime. This picture was taken, 2 hours after high tide. And what was interesting, again, here is that it's like a time registration where it clocks the movement of the moon, registers the movements of the tide, without physically actually being able to see the sea. So and this was a discovery for me, that in losing the sense of the sight, it was even more heightened by just the sound and through the movement of the water, the registration of what was outside. Again, an important thing that I want to bring up is that India's ebb and flow, and I'm using that, the movement of people is on the lunar cycle. Holidays, most of India takes holidays on full moon and no moon. In fact, today is the day of no moon, and the carpenters don't work. You can do anything, and they will not work on this one specific day. And this is something that they've been practicing for I don't know how long. But I think what's important is this idea of time, the variable of time, and the fluidity of time, which is very important. Overlapped on this, we also have Greenwich Mean Time. That's part of the reason why we have so many holidays, but that's secondary. So this condition or this conflict of both these time conditions is also, I think, an important situation in a way to understand the movement of the country. So this ebb and flow of people from cities back home, back to their villages, and this constant migration that takes place, all based on the cycle of the moon. That's the plan of the house. The well lies underneath there. And the whole idea of that is that it protects the navel, protects the belly button in a way, which is really the foundation. And the house implodes into the water and can even explode and come out of the water, in a sense, giving birth. That's the point of creation. And everything then responds to this one action of protecting the water, of protecting the source of water. Again, the idea of connection, that we have to go to the source of water rather than water come to you through a pipe. And so you develop a relationship through sight, through smell, through condition, and that also becomes a process of a way of caring, I think. And I think that's very important, is this idea of care and consideration when one makes things. Sorry. This plaster was developed, again, by accident. It's quite a large plan. And the idea that this texture or the color, it's a graphite, comes from the shadow that was created by the roof. And we did a sort of quick test where we painted one wall white or sort of a light color, and then this one was sort of highly polished, very simple lime plaster. And the house sort of receded in the background. And so here it sort of is this idea of shade and shadow. We have a lot of sun, and the idea of actually shade, or in a sense controlling the amount of sun. And this is something which was very different from what I had learned studying in the West, about modernism, Corbusier, all this idea of bringing in the light. And here it's more about the absence of the light, or sort of or dimming of the light, which in a sense heightens the condition that is outside. This is a project we did. This was in a coconut plantation on the coastline. My client actually only bought this piece of land primarily because it was, up close to the sea. But I made this story about this obsession with coconut trees. Again, we don't have a typology of where you would actually build inside a dense coconut plantation. But what was interesting was this fabulous canopy that existed. There was this existing canopy, columns, and this amazing roof. So half our work was done. The sun was already, a lot of the sun had been taken care of through this existing vegetation. And again, this idea, this is about a 150-year-old coconut plantation. We traded a lot with Africa, with West Africa. So pepper was grown in this region. And these plantations, in a sense, have a sense of time and history. So to treat landscape in the same way that we would look at, old buildings, old cities, old towns, that could we intervene with that same sensitivity to what has been here and what can continue to be here, and in some way add to that condition in a way that takes it to another place. But anyway, the water, this is the irrigation canals that draw the water from these wells for the trees. Just an atmosphere of the place. These are measured drawings. This is a working drawing model. At that time, I was working by myself, and I had the carpenters and some of the masons, and it's much easier for them, rather than seeing drawings, to actually build these models. And we make these marks pretty accurate, I would say, down to a few millimeters, if anything. And again, the idea of tolerance, the idea of a dimension, that at some point, a dimension can resonate or oscillate. It doesn't have to be 12.5 mm and that's it. It's the truth and nothing else can exist. I think this idea of, where does that building rest, or where does a dimension rest, and, what is the tolerance that one can give it for it to oscillate? Because otherwise it can become quite regimented, and then you can find yourself stuck. So this is sort of full-scale mock-ups using the thin sort of arecanut trees, the supari trees there. We just cut some of them down because they had gone past their date in which they sort of bear fruit, and then new ones were planted. So you can see the sort of these structures kind of vaguely in the background. But that's the drawing, that's the model that we used to actually, that was the set of drawings we had. And you can see here, just, every day we made these. Every day we made these. What we fundamentally have, maybe even now on site, is just a plan, broad dimensions, and the rest is all based on memory, on an understanding of height, proportions, and a memory of making these things. Just again, views and conditions of what we're inspired by every day that we sort of driving through, or just conditions that one comes across all the time. And this idea of the way it's tied and the simplicity in which this fence is made. That's our anti-termite treatment, basically. It's smoking these Palmyra louvers, which is basically the wooden bark. And a palm tree has a very soft inner line, sort of an internal core, which was taken out, and then the hard shell was cut out or sliced. So you still maintain this sort of curve to shed the rain. But this is the construction. No earth was displayed, no machinery, all hand cut. So because of this, we really have to sort of engage in a way that we use minimum energy to move things or displace things. And so the idea of observing, carefully observing, and then making an intervention so that we're able to retain the energy and that we don't end up using a lot of energy chasing something where you find yourself then sort of, running behind your own tail. So this whole project really is sort of constructed on the coastline. And that's those louvers that you saw they were smoking here. It's all handmade, hand-built, and it was done in a period of 8 months from the time of on-site to the finished assembly on-site. Just again, mock-ups and details. And this is, the color was inspired, the color inside the house was inspired by the lichen growing on these trees. I'm going to quickly run through this. What I like about, or what I discovered in this project, again, very much like that well or the underground water source, was this idea of the visual again. The air outside and the air inside the building, the ambient temperature is identical. So while you have this structure that gives you the protection, like a piece of clothing, you're still engaged with the outdoors. Even visually, there's one room where you don't really have a visual out to the landscape, but just through the sound of the sea, through the temperature of the air that dissipates through these louvers, what is out and in is, I think, blurred. And again, this coming from the senses that we have, that get heightened in the closing of one of the senses. Just details that we've developed, again, through research, through looking at structures that have been built in the past, understanding their spans, understanding the geometry, their proportions. And again, this system was something that I had to work with because they were familiar. Way back, one of the early projects I developed, worked on it for 6 months, and they stood there looking at these plans, and I knew at that point in time there is absolutely no way this house is going to get built. And that was the point we chucked the drawings. And I didn't mention that earlier, but that was the process in which how this whole sort of studio Mumbai actually evolved. So a familiarity and understanding, a way of connecting to their past, but also the possibility of learning from that and then moving in a new direction. Again, the idea for us is that, what we're capable of. If I can span 3 meters, we build in 3 meters. If the knowledge base is of that limitation, we use that limitation not as a way that constricts us, but allows us to expand, saying that it's acceptable. No, we don't need to go for a large span roof right now. And in time, it's a slow process. You gain 3, then 4, then 5. But it's not about that. I think for us, it's more important is the quality that a building can evoke. The idea of going beyond shelter, going beyond protection, into something that has something magical. Maybe there's a mystery. It has its own life. It breathes. And we're interested in that possible potential of architecture where it goes beyond its own physical limitations. This was a project we did in the mountains. It's a 2-hour walk from the nearest motorable drive. It's at about 8,500 feet up in the Himalayas. And we had to do a sort of traveler's lodge. People go up into the sort of higher Himalayas for treks, and then this is used like a base camp. That's the site right there. It's a plateau, and my client, who is the same client that I built those wooden boxes for, and he had set up these 2 tents. Of course, they were from North India, from the desert, and sort of quizzically looked at me one day and said that we've put up these tents, but it somehow doesn't seem to work because naturally, I mean, in the winter time with the snow and the wind, these tents were blown away. So he said, can you go and have a look and see if there's something we can do? And this was great for me because this is something I've always dreamed of. There's such a rich diversity and tradition of building and a knowledge of building up from the north to the east to the west, and conditions are completely different. And this is something that has evolved over the years. I think it still even exists in Switzerland in many ways. Carpentry, stonework, it's all there. But for me, the interest was possibly how to tie the two together. The way, the culture that I come from, or where we all come from, to what is sort of rooted in this place. And it made sense. Sort of, act of least resistance is to sort of use the local technology, use the local know-how. So we did about 5 trips to study their buildings, understand their proportions, and then we decided to build in the way that they're familiar with. Of course, these guys out here and protest, saying that, we're not interested. This doesn't seem to work. And then these guys are listening to me, and it's all about, again, like I said, relationship, where you have to give, in a sense that. I would say there's a sort of humility that you have to engage in with the people who build. So it's not a series of instructions, but something that is more participatory. And so that's the earlier gesture. And then a few hours later, we were already making a line out. We did the practice in the studio, but we actually went to site, and we drew the buildings. For 4 days, we just drew them down with this chalk. So, full-scale drawings, markings being made. And it's quite intense, this idea of making lines. Somehow there's something very special for me when you make these full-scale drawings on site, and you can sort of begin to understand their relationships. And you can see everyone, even the cook, is now involved in the construction. Part of the building was made at a workshop. The wood was then transported. And we had to configure it because all this had to be carried by porters. So the dimensions, the proportions, the joints, all that had to be considered in what could be carried or not carried through the site. Stone was harvested about half a kilometer away, and you can see that's about a few thousand feet, drop. And that's the closest village where the road stops is right there. And you kind of have to go all the way around to get back to that site. Again, like I was showing you earlier, just the relationship and postures and the different positions taken in the act of making architecture. All this seems very primitive, compared to what you build here. But I think it's not about sophistication or primitivity. I think it's the ethos or the ethic or the spirit that you hold in the process of making, I think, which is fundamental. And I think this idea can be universal, no matter where we are located geographically. You can see the proximity of how the material is being brought to site. This image is interesting or important because we have to give the land back to the farmers, part of the guys who were actually building the project. After 10 years, it's a lease for 10 years. And one of the conditions was they didn't want anything permanent, as in i.e. concrete or anything that was cast in place. So this is a slide that we had imagined in a sense that something existed there, and then we came in there and found this condition to sort of piggyback or take opportunity of. So it depends which way you want to actually look at it, from back to front or front to back. But it's just for me sort of an important sort of potential of what could have existed or what can continue to exist. Also this idea of ruin and decay, where you still have the genus loci of the place intact. So this idea of intervention, action, but at the same time respecting the location or the nature of the place. Very quickly, I don't know if I do I have some time or yeah. This was a project we did for the Victoria Albert Museum. It was an exhibition, or rather an installation that had to be done, and it was called Place of Refuge or Contemplation. And our interest, because I think universally this idea of a place for refuge, contemplation, worship, library, they seem to be places of immense silence, a very perfect, constructed, spatial condition. And what we were interested rather was in this place where there's extreme chaos and conditions where you wouldn't imagine that they could be actually occupied. So this is actually a boundary. This is between two buildings. This is a few meters wide, and this was right behind our studio. It was an old warehouse, and that's the adjacent compound, and it's actually the setback between the two. And these are sort of, I would call them unauthorized, illegal structures. Now, if you take a cross-section of Mumbai, what is actually on the official document of Mumbai and what is the spatial condition of Mumbai are completely different. So more than 50% of Mumbai is occupied in a way that is, so to speak, doesn't actually exist in the official documentation of the city. And that was a place of actually interest to us, is that there were sort of very interesting places that are formed in between architecture. Again, traditionally, boundaries were delineated by trees. I think that also happens here in Switzerland. And then as development occurred, walls were built. And, if the tree was lucky enough to be slightly on one side of the fence or the other, it would get saved. But how the tree was then used to make a dwelling, that became a place to locate a dwelling inside this very constricted condition. While it might seem very extreme, there was a certain beauty and a certain way that they were able to engage. I mean, even if you just look at this little detail there, which separates the street, because there are many houses like that which are in a row, and you actually walk through the living room of someone's house. But just this change in level creates what is private and public. And it's interesting, they also made their own codes. That's the fire access that they maintain. So anyway, this is a scheme that we presented. I'm just going to show sort of more slides of just the existing place and how this tree is important in a way for them to align themselves. You take the tree away and there could be a displacement which can be in many ways not forgiving, but it's interesting, just this very intuitive sort of response to this idea of the tree holding that space. That's the corridor. Sometimes it gets down to 600. Would make the Swiss codes, but that's okay. I think it's this symbiotic relationship that the neighbors have, how they are able to live and construct these buildings, accommodating these kinds of conditions. So this was our abstraction. It's a full-scale sort of model made in plaster of Paris. Partly also because of the fragility of these places. So the fragility of the material of plaster, of it being easily broken. It was in the plaster courts in London at the Victoria Albert Museum. And what we're trying to show is basically this is fragments of a city. So we've actually taken a fragment of Mumbai and transposed it into this site. Making a measure drawing of the tree in our back compound that could best sort of come closest to the existing tree condition. Obviously, we couldn't go in there and cast, and that's just the making of the project. Trials, experiments, color samples, and this goes on for a few weeks. To get the right sense, to get the right light, and this is all made in plaster. So the structure was actually built in our workshop dismantled, and then shipped to London and then re-erected there in that space. And this is Bombay. This is the texture of Bombay in construction. So it's this idea of a bas relief, a relief on the walls, because Bombay is in constant construction. We actually cast concrete and then we take a hammer and hack at it. This is the tooth for plaster, because at least on the West Coast, if you have exposed concrete, most of it, and you do see a lot of it, goes into this sort of very drab, black sort of algae or this black patina, and it looks like, in many ways looks like hell. But this is what we do to the concrete once it's cast. I just think it's an interesting situation. We're actually now doing what we call forensic studies, where we've taken these pieces of concrete where stuff is growing out of it. So rather than make your own green wall, there's a potential to have the entire building as a way to sort of construct a landscape without actually doing the work. But anyway, I'll just go forward. That's our workshop in the background. That's the whole process of that color that you saw. Our interest is in the spatial qualities, not so much about the dirt, the lack of an infrastructure, but the potential of how man is able to make space in a very extreme condition. And you see this all the time. I think, and that for me is very inspirational in the potential of finding a way to sort of continuously work in very extreme sort of tight conditions. So this is a house or a dwelling for 8 people. It's about 100 square feet, which is about 10 square meters. But there's outdoors, indoors, sleeping spaces. Turns are taken of who sleeps at what time. And it's a sort of like a moving city, small moving city inside this small space. And what was odd was, as we were building this structure, the original structure that we had measured was actually coming down. It was going under demolition after about 70 years, because the land had now been sold forward to a developer, and a new high-rise was coming up. So these people have lived there for 3 generations. And so we went back and just documented just the markings that were left behind, the humanizing of that space. I'll show you another house. This in a place called Alibag. It's primarily an agriculture field. We kept most of the agriculture field for rice farming. These are sort of people from Mumbai who are moving to the rural countryside. And some of them are weekend retreats, and eventually one hopes that they would actually, in time, physically move there. But again, for us, the interest was in the symbiosis of these two conditions. So we sort of kept the footprint, minimized the footprint on this 5-acre lot, which was primarily rice farming. Again, here, the assistance of the existing mango trees, and the house sort of weaves itself through the mango trees, which partly provides shade, shelter from the wind. And what's wonderful is you can actually physically open the house in a very extreme condition, and you're protected, which I can show you through some of the slides. But that's the sort of measured drawing that we take, site condition. And in a sense, it's something that you begin to understand. You get a sense of the space by doing these sort of markings or measurements. It's the sort of envelope of space around you that it becomes part of your, I wouldn't say subconscious, but you can close your eyes and have a sense of things. Things are wrapped around you. And then, so when you draw or when you make things, you have the sense of a tree, a rock, the amount of airspace. And I think that's very important because it becomes more three-dimensional as opposed to looking onto a sort of two-dimensional plan. So this is an exercise I still like to maintain. It's like a survey of the site. I like to go and draw, physically measure the site. And it's more of more than a dimension, it's to get familiar with the surroundings. Again, building up a relationship. So it's a working landscape. I have, paddy field in the monsoon, and we have mustard in the winter time. You can see some reflection of that. So I have actually a working landscape that exists and continues sort of the tradition of farming, as well as this sort of overlap that has recently occurred. This is the last project. This is something we started last year. And he knew exactly where the water was. And I know this all sounds strange and mystical, but it's a fact. And so he marked this point and said, this is exactly the point that you will find water at this height. And sure enough, it was the peak of summer, the water table is at its lowest, and we hit water. Now this water kind of doesn't look very exciting at the moment, but in time it settles. And so this is the excavation. We used the excavation as a fill for the house. And then we allowed the monsoon to naturally compress the soil. So there was no one standing there watering the soil, trying to compact it. But it was important to hit that time. Again, going back to the idea of the lunar cycle, the idea of climatic conditions or seasons, and that architecture or the idea of making architecture becoming responsive to seasons, and actually using the seasons to your advantage. So this is just a slide showing that, again, very primitive. Just you can see how that is made. This is that 65-year-old mason who's been with me now about 15 years. And it's interesting because they sort of have a great philosophy or a sort of, I don't know, I can't say they, in a way, think from their stomach, if it makes any sense. I don't know how to explain that. It's not thinking from the head, but it's a sensation that they actually act from somewhere here. And that's the fill. No trucks, no JCBs, shifted by hand. Not that many people that we had. We had about, we had 1.2 billion, so 20 is not that bad. But it was quite effortless. And so half the work is done. And then we basically made pile foundations to actually support the slab of the house. Also, this floods during the monsoons from time to time. So this idea of creating a high ground was important. Material came for free from this well, which is then going to be used for the house. Drawings that we make, and you erase it, you redraw it. And this model is actually here in the exhibition space. But we use that, as a measuring device to go back, and so you can see full-scale drawings being made. That's where we started as a concept. So the house was set in a clearing, and I'm actually using these existing big, large trees to protect the house in the monsoon. For us, the monsoons are a very difficult climatic condition. So by pushing the house into this clearing and pressing it in here very passively, so there's no glazing, there's no glass in the monsoon, because the density of the leaves increase on the trees, you get a greater cover or a greater protection from the wind and the rain. So this is actually a screened porch or a screened living room. So for 8 months of the year, you have this amazing weather that you can basically keep the house open through most part of the day. That's just the plan again. You can see that's the existing ground there, and that's the raised sort of plinth. Again, just architecture that we see and we learn from. Nothing special, but just in a way to educate ourselves. And that was the development of this particular project. So mock-ups, we did, all the different window details. And it's fabulous because the clients come and there's a certain way that, there's the resistance, so to speak, client, architect, all of that sort of dissipates. And it's one that is, I think, mutually beneficial to all because everything is exposed or made transparent. In a sense, you lay bare everything that one wants to communicate. So it's a very open way to, for me at least, or what we found, an open way to communicate architecture. Again, just quick models, elevations. These are shots of the model. These are our working drawings, and you can see the skill. The same guys who were drawing earlier about 5 years ago, and you can see the quality of their lines. And it's incredible. They produce about 20 of these every day. Again, what's, I think, important, which I didn't talk about, is that it's developed to a certain point where that we can actually respond at the 11th hour just to refine it or to modify it where it is absolutely appropriate. Because no matter how much you draw it, how much you think it, there's always something that is left. And it's that moment in time where we're able to actually go in and take it a little further. And I like that idea of keeping things a little open. It doesn't mean that this doesn't go through planning regulations and all of that. But like I said, it's about that dimension that allows you to oscillate between 2 points. Again, just studies. These are done by my carpenters. Just conditions of which way should we resolve that condition, and just a brief discussion, and then this is what they come back and produce, and then we talk about it. What happened to that? Sorry. I don't know if this will work. Nope. That's odd. Nope. Anyway, this is I wish I could play this. That's a bit sad. Thank you.